Alrighty, welcome everyone. All right, good afternoon everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lisa Dush, and I'm a professor in DePaul's Department of Writing, Rhetoric, and Discourse, and I'm the faculty director of HumanitiesX, which is co-sponsoring today's event with DePaul's Department of Philosophy. Before I introduce today's speaker, Agnes Callard, I'd like to briefly introduce HumanitiesX, which will also give some context for our invitation to Professor Callard. HumanitiesX is a multi-year initiative in DePaul's College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences, funded by the Mellon Foundation. Its main aim is to have an annual fellowship awarded to teams of faculty, community partners, and student interns, and to support them as they collaboratively design and deliver project-based courses from humanities perspectives. Each year, all of the HumanitiesX courses engage a common theme, selected because it captures a current and vexing challenge. And our inaugural theme, selected in late 2019, is immigration and migration. Now, of course, the pandemic and the events of 2020 are also current and vexing challenges. And along with delaying the launch of our first cohort of fellows for 1 year, it's given me and my colleagues the opportunity to envision other ways that humanists can meaningfully engage during this moment. We've invited Professor Callard to speak with us today on the topic of writing in this moment, because she's one of the most prolific scholars writing for public audiences during the pandemic. If you logged into the webinar in time to see its opening slide, that was a collage of the public writing that Agnes has produced in 2020, 15 pieces in total. By the end of April 2020, not yet 2 months into lockdown, Agnes had published 6 pandemic-related articles in venues including The New Yorker and The New York Times on topics ranging from how humanists can respond in times of crisis to why it is so satisfying to beat your children at board games during quarantine. When the racial justice protests surged in May and June, she wrote again, publishing on whether we should cancel Aristotle and on how to, quote, help students talk and think rationally on whether we should, on whatever ethical problems are on their minds. Said simply, Agnes Callard has thought her way through the pandemic and made her thoughts and thinking available to others. Today, we will engage her in a conversation about why and how she does this. Dr. Callard is a professor at the University of Chicago in the Department of Philosophy. Many of her courses focus on the works of the ancient Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. Her book, Aspiration, The Agency of Becoming, which theorizes how we can aspire to and become different and better people, was published in 2017. And in 2020, she published the edited collection on anger. Agnes has won major academic prizes. She's quite active on Twitter. She's been a guest on many a podcast, and she started the Night Owls, a late night philosophy debate on the University of Chicago campus, which attracts hundreds of students. In short, she's an energetic and generous thinker, and it's been a pleasure to read her work, to think alongside her in preparation for today's event. So before we begin, let me just give an overview of our plan for the hour. Dr. Callard's going to begin by giving us a talk for about 15 minutes. And then after that, for a total of about another 15 minutes, our 2 respondents, Dr. Margaret Story from DePaul's Department of History and philosophy student, Paulo Astorias, will engage in a conversation with Dr. Callard around several questions that they've prepared in advance. And then the remainder of the time, at least 20 minutes, is reserved for audience questions, which I'll pull out of the Q&A and ask Agnes. So please just submit your questions at any time, and I'll do my best to pass on as many as I can to Agnes during the Q&A time. And now I'd like to hand things over to Agnes. Oh, you're muted, Agnes.
I just said that was a really lovely introduction. Thank you so much. So I was at there's a big conference every year for academic philosophers called, it's the American Philosophical Association Conference. I mean, we have 3 of them, but one of the 3 is bigger. The biggest one is the East Coast Conference. I mean, this year it was by Zoom. And in one of the, I had gotten this prize together with another philosopher, and there was this sort of prize giving session for all the people who won all the prizes, all the academic prizes, right? And these are academic philosophers, right? and you know, they were handed out, and then there were breakout rooms afterwards where you could have conversations. And one of the breakout rooms was philosophy in the pandemic. And I was like, cool, I really want to talk to other philosophers and like think about like, how do we talk about philosophy during the pandemic? So I went to this breakout room and no one showed up. I was there for 10 minutes. I was just sitting there quietly, and I'm like, someone's gonna come. And no one came. And I thought about this yesterday when I was on Twitter the day before yesterday, and there was a journalist tweeting like how, you know, it was something like psychologically healthy and academically accomplished philosophers don't go near Twitter. And I do think that there's a kind of sense in the discipline of like trying to hold oneself back, like that there's a quagmire, or there's a morass, or there's a kind of corrupting force that we could be getting ourselves into, right? And like, if you're interested in philosophy, why not just do philosophy and just talk to other philosophers about philosophy? Philosophers are great at talking philosophy. They're super interesting. They make fantastic objections. They listen really carefully. They are great interlocutors. As a group of people, I can't think of a group of people who are better interlocutors than philosophers, academic, professional philosophers. Like, that's kind of why I became a philosopher, like for the company. And so I wanted to say something about like, I'm sort of imagining I'm speaking to those people and being like, yeah, but there's something valuable in not retreating. And I think like one way to think about it is just to think about how the tradition of philosophy that we're sort of coming out of got started. You know, this is like 5th century Athens. And you get this sort of culture of public performance that comes out of the institution of democracy, right? Because in a democracy, all the citizens are they go to the assembly, and it's a direct democracy, and they make speeches. And so suddenly making speeches in public is like a big thing that everyone does and everyone has to learn how to do, right? And, you know, at the same time, you're getting this culture of public performance in the form of plays, right? Tragedies and comedies, right? And in that context of this kind of very public culture comes Socrates, right? Who's this guy who walks up to people and he asks them questions. And he didn't just ask questions of his family members or the people he knew well. He asked questions of just about anybody. And a kind of new form of inquiry and thought became possible because of that kind of publicity, right? And I think we're in kind of a similar moment. Like, we're in a very exciting moment in terms of public intellectual culture. So like, and here I'm not, you know, this is called writing in this moment, right? But like, this is a kind of vague referring term, right? It's never clear how far back do we go? But I think like, if I want to go as far back as, you know, if I think back to my early years of grad school, I would never have predicted that there would be a philosophy column in the New York Times. Like, as a graduate student, that would have shocked me. Like, in the New York Times, like New York Times readers want to read philosophy, but there's a column like every week or so. And I've written some of them, right? But that's amazing, that kind of hunger for philosophical ideas. And I feel that in the public in a way that it just didn't used to be there. And I think, you know, one other place that shows up is on social media. Like, there's lots that's bad about social media, but there really is. People really are interested in philosophical ideas. And that means that you can kind of test out your ideas on them. But why is it good? Why is it good to test it out on them as opposed to, say, academic philosophers? So I think one thing is, when you're speaking to a public audience, you have to get to the point. And that forces you to see what your most important point was. Like, because a lot of times in a philosophy article, like, I've made so many distinctions and responded to so many objections that by the end, it would actually even be hard for me to say, like, what was my main idea, right? What's the important part? And then this is maybe even bigger than that. You have to keep hold of what is important about your idea. Like, why does this matter? You're constantly selling it to people. And I think that it's really important to be sort of, in a sense, you might say, held accountable in that way of having to sell your ideas to people all the time, and tell them like why it's important. And that's even important as far as truth goes, I think. Like I went to a talk the other day. This is an academic philosophy talk, and it was a Kantian theory of love. I mean, that is, it was a theory of Kant, but it was sort of giving a Kantian reading. And it was a Kantian reading of the story, The Gift of the Magi. So if you know what happens in the story, there's like this couple that love each other, but they're poor. And the husband's prized possession is his watch, and the wife's prized possession is her beautiful hair. And the husband, but they don't have money, but they want to get each other a really great present. So the husband sells the watch to buy the wife a hair combs. And the wife gets her hair cut and sells the hair to buy him a watch, a new maybe strand for his watch. Okay, and this person used the example to show that that like there's something wrong in the kind of love that is insufficiently self-interested or self-concerned, right? So that was the point of the example, was that this was a defective kind of love. Because these two, it symbolizes the fact that these two people are not sufficiently self-interested, and thus they give each other these things that are not good for one another. Okay. And I want to say there's nothing wrong with this. It was a good talk. It was very interesting, right? But what I was going through my head the whole time as I was listening to the talk, I was like, I wonder if I had to give this as a bit of public philosophy, right? And giving it to the public, like how would this look? And like, I'd be like, you know what I would do? The first thing I would do is go reread the story and see, what is O. Henry's take? O. Henry's the author of the short story, right? And it was a Zoom talk, so I could do that while listening to the talk, So I went over and read the short story. And at the end of the story, O. Henry says, this is real love. And these people are the true magi. They are the ones who gave the right sorts of gifts. And I'm like, wow. So O. Henry's take is not that this is a defective kind of love, and is not that they made some kind of mistake. His take is that there's something that they got the best gifts they could possibly get, right? And like, once again, if this were public philosophy, I would be in a way accountable to that story and to that human experience, that a certain kind of selflessness is essential to love, right? And like, that's, to me, like, if I want to write about love in a way that's compelling, I think I'm going to just kind of do a better job if I take my audience to be people who are really in a kind of direct way testing what I'm saying against their own experiences. Or at the very least, if I do some of that. So I think that that is, that's those two things, namely getting to the point and kind of staying in touch with what's essential about the human experience, make, I think, doing public philosophy really valuable for philosophers, and more of us should be doing it. And not only that, but, it's a time when I think some exciting new form of engagement could precipitate out of a certain kind of public mess, right? Which is just what happened in democratic Athens, right? It was, of course, a mess, it collapsed into tyranny again, and it didn't last long, but forms of culture and intellectual life precipitated out of it. So maybe let me end. I'll say one last thing. I haven't quite used up 15 minutes, but I think that's okay because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. Just like I've been saying, like, what's in it for me, or what's in it for people like me? Maybe I should say something like, what's in it for you, if you're the recipient of the right? Because there is something oddly asymmetrical about public philosophy, right? In a way, it's more asymmetrical than academic philosophy is more like arguing back and forth. Even if someone gives a talk, then there's a Q&A, there's a lot of back and forth. There's a little bit less back and forth. There is some, but a little bit less. So I think, I think we all just go through our lives already presupposing answers to a bunch of questions about what's important. And you just can't do anything without already thinking you have those answers. You start with the answers, weirdly, right? You don't notice, you never heard the question, you heard the answer first. And one way that Socrates illustrates this in a dialogue called the Alcibiades is by saying, Alcibiades, when you were a little, I remember you from when you were a little kid and you were playing like dice with other kids and you would yell out, "Hey, you cheated." How did you know what justice was when you were like a little kid? When did you learn it, right? And the point is you didn't learn it. You just always thought you knew what it was, right? So that's the way we are with a lot of our most fundamental concepts about justice and right and wrong and just what makes a life worthwhile. And I think that it kind of takes active work and intervention to start to almost like cast a little bit of light there on the questions as being possible questions that a person could ask. And I think that's something philosophers can help you with. They can help you see that those answers are actually answers to questions that you could potentially answer differently. But even if you don't want to answer them differently, you might want to, in effect, appropriate your answers as answers. And I think, something that Aristotle says in his book, The Nicomachean Ethics, is like, if we got clearer on all that, we'd be better at aiming at what we wanted, right? So we got clearer on the fact that like, I'm doing this for this reason, then we just become better at sort of orienting our lives at a deep level. So that's something I think philosophy can do for people.
Thank you so much, Agnes. This is really great. It's really fun. Hi, everybody. I'm Margaret Story, and I am going to help just get into some of these ideas with Agnes and pull out a few things. And I'm going to hand it over to Paula, our student member of our little team here today. And then we'll hand it over for Q&A. So be sure you're putting those questions into the Q&A queue. So I'm going to pick up right where you left off there with questions, because one of the pieces of yours that I found really interesting and very thought-provoking was how to politicize the classroom. And for everybody who's watching me, I'm having to look at a screen to get my notes, so forgive me if I'm going back and forth a little bit. But in it, you're talking about the relationship between the teaching and the political. And you say, if true politics and real leadership is available nowhere else, we should at least make sure to offer a model of it at our colleges and universities. And you note, after talking, I think, a very humane way about your own sort of missteps or what you perceive as missteps in the classroom, which I think we've all done, and I certainly identified with. You say, my students are not detached, not from their feelings, not from their values, and not from the events happening in the world around them. If I am to be their teacher, I cannot be detached either. They want to talk about what matters here and now, and that is the conversation I need to be in a position to facilitate. And so my question for you about that has to do with questioning. In what way is humanistic inquiry the way to help us facilitate those conversations? How does the process of inquiry and modeling inquiry help our students with grappling with what matters to them?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think that the main the sort of the schema of an answer, there's a lot of different ways, but the sort of schema of an answer is like, it's to allow them to sort of question and investigate this area, an area of their life where something is like very important, with, while not at the same time like threatening it, and not like not being like oh, this actually doesn't matter, or you actually have no grip on this, or right. So there's you know, to show them that it's sort of like possible to be inquisitive about it, and you know, like in the, I mean, the case, for instance, I think one of the cases that I discuss in that piece was like we're reading a novel in which there's a description of sexual assault, and you know, there's like there's a couple different approaches you could take to that, right? One of them is like, not talk about that part of the novel, right? And another is like talk about it, but immediately find some way to like condemn it as bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I was trying to do is be like, why is this so upsetting for this girl? What happens to her, right? What about it is upsetting? Let's not assume that we already know the answer to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in a way that it's very hard to ask that question, to put that question before people in such a way that they don't feel that what's needed is a defense of the idea that it really is wrong, right? So that's sort of what I mean, is like to create that space where it's like, it's okay to be curious about this. And you can be curious about it without giving up your morals and without giving up your thought that this is wrong. This is wrong, but we don't actually know why exactly, right? We don't actually know what is bad about it. And like, let's try to think about it. And like, I later talked to the student who was upset. And she's like, the reason I was upset is that for the first time, I felt like I actually understood why I had been upset by this thing happening to me. That's what made me feel like, okay, I did like the right thing there, and that in that case. So that's like one kind of, I mean, most of the time that's not what I'm talking about in class, but that was a particular example that did come up in that piece. But I think that students are often kind of almost like exhilarated to realize you can talk about this stuff.
Yeah.
That there aren't just these two options of, in effect, that are both in some way defensive. There's an undefensive possibility.
Yeah, I think it's such a great way to frame it, that inquiry is what helps us understand the full humanness of what's happened or whatever we're exploring. And the defensive positions flatten, code, categorize, force into places that can't be discussed. And so we lose the depth of the human when we can't explore our curiosity and try to gain deeper, more complex understanding. I really appreciated that. And I appreciated the model for how you did it in the classroom, because I think that for faculty, it can be challenging to know how to facilitate that kind of inquiry in a way that builds a space for really deep and meaningful conversation with our students. And this is a time where we feel that it behooves us to do that. There's an awful lot of weight right now on what we're trying to convey in the classroom. If I could, I'll just follow up a little bit with the piece you wrote in the New Yorker at the beginning of the pandemic. And hopefully some people have read this piece. It's really, I think, quite really kind of a remarkable piece, and I very much appreciate it. It was in April 2020 is when it was published. I don't know how long it was that you wrote it before it appeared, but it's titled, What Do the Humanities Do in a Crisis? And you reflect very honestly about your feeling of being undone in the life of the mind, of not being able to inhabit that space in the middle of the upheaval of what we were all going through. And I certainly could understand that. I'm quite sure our students can relate to this a lot. But you said you never understood the value of this in exactly the same way until you weren't able to do it and wanted to do it so badly. And then go on to say that, and this is a quote, crises are, at least while they are happening, not educational opportunities. These are events that befall us, that harm us. They target everything about us, including our faculty for learning. And I wondered, now that we've, as you said before, you mentioned, when is this moment? When did it start? When does it end? I'm going to kind of play that back to you and just say, from the vantage point of January 2021, how does April 2020 look to you? I mean, how do you look back at that thinking now that we've moved through some of this, and also that the crisis has shifted and changed and morphed in different ways over the course of those months?
Yeah, good. So one of the things that I was thinking of, though I don't know that I articulated it there, I can't remember now, but I heard a lot of this pandemic is a test, you're being tested of like, do you really care about whatever it is that you do, or can you prove yourself useful even in a pandemic? And so like, and some of what I'm sort of pushing back against in that piece is the idea that like, this is the right test of the humanities, right? I think we should do everything we can, but this is not, I don't think it's a test. In fact, it's not even that it's the wrong test. I think it's a mistake to think of the humanities as something that needs to be tested in that way. And that's, the higher forms of human functioning are not, I don't think should be asked to prove their worth under conditions of bare survival. It's the other way around. The reason we want to get out of the conditions of bare survival is for the sake of having access to the higher forms of human functioning. So at that point, I think still holds. But in terms of looking back, I think one thing I would say is like, weirdly enough, I underestimated how diligent I still was and how many of my pre-pandemic habits I still had in April by contrast to now. Like, I feel like the pandemic has slowly degraded me in ways that were less like quick and crisis-like and more slow and imperceptible, such that almost like, many decades of habits were undone by just too much screen time and not enough other people time, and like my gym is closed and it's harder to pay attention to anything, and it's just harder to work and like harder and harder. And so it's like I felt that in March and April. I felt that difference of myself sliding downhill, but like I've slid way further downhill since then. It's not that I've like gone back up. And I think it's going to take a long time for a lot of us to kind of rebuild just like our ability to peacefully and calmly contemplate the eternal truths.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. I think there are moments where there's some new space, but the lack of the connectivity, and I don't just mean socializing, I somehow the tangibleness of the world, for me is what I feel like somehow I didn't appreciate how much that mattered to thinking. And somehow it really has. I'll follow up with one little bit and then I want to hand it over to Paula. In that piece, you talk a lot about a writer named, I think you would say his name is Jean Amery, is that right? And you call him a humanistic hero and a teacher. And you're very interested in the way that he confesses in his own writing about the failure of his humanistic learning under the brutality of the concentration camps in the Second World War. And then you marvel at the ability of his words to reach you in this moment. And you say it's a beautiful sentence, that his words, quote, sail across the gulf of time and space and culture, and the deepest gulf of all between the one who has been tortured and the one who has not, to address the reader in the native language of her own mind. In the end, she cannot help but let him in. This is an astonishing communicative triumph. One would not have thought that humanistic learning was up to such a test. And so I bring that back to just say, why did you think one would not have thought it? What about it seems surprising? And then why do you think it was able to?
Yeah, so I think that, part of it is like what he's trying to do is describe the experience of torture and the experience of living in a really humiliated condition.
Yes.
And feeling humiliated by his own mind, by the fact that like all of the things I prided myself on, all of my skills are useless in this context. And my like sophistication and all the ways that I like say pride myself on being better than like, you know, I don't know, like when one group he talks about are like super religious people, right? Who he might have looked down on before as being less sophisticated than him. And he's like, well, their religion actually kind of seems to help them, whereas my thing is not helping me at all, right? So it's a physical and intellectual kind of state of degradation, right, that he's experiencing. And like, I think I think I would have been ready to be like, oh, there's something ineffable about that. You know, one can't say it, like one can't communicate it, like for the very reason that it itself is not up to the task of like helping you live through the moment, right? Like I could imagine that abstract argument, but that was wrong because he really does communicate it. And of course, you know, you're not like, no writer can actually give you some other experience you haven't had, but he gives you a lot more than you thought you would be able to get.
Yeah.
So whenever that happens, whenever any writer really captures an experience, they're giving you more than you thought you would get. Because if there's this element of surprise of like, oh, I can live in this other world, like I can sort of get this in a way that I never thought I'd be able to.
I love that. I think that's there's something transcendent there that allows us to travel that distance. Yeah, that's really, thank you. That's great. Paula, can I hand it over to you, everyone? This is Paula Asturias, who is a student who works with us in the HumanitiesX project.
Hi everybody, and hi Agnes.
Hey.
I want to start with just saying like how much I enjoyed like reading your work the past couple of weeks, and I was to do kind of like research for my questions. I was looking at like all your articles from like The Point, and I was particularly interested by like, is philosophy like a fight club? And like here you describe how you got kind of like locked in an argument with like a mean philosopher at one of your talks, but he ultimately appreciated like his attack. And immediately when I read this piece with like the context of like public philosophy, I kind of thought about like how in public philosophy we're like creating a space. And I was wondering if you believe that there are any like rules in these spaces, and like, is being mean, for example, like with this philosopher, is that something that's tolerated? And is there anything that like cannot or like should not be said in this space?
Yeah, so I would not behave the way this person behaved. And I don't like condone it. And I don't think it was like good. That is, there was a lot that was unnecessary about it, right? So I think you know, I think that part of it is that this person is like he was an older man, and he you know, is an artifact of an earlier stage of philosophical culture, let's say. So like when I was in grad school, in my early years of grad school, you know, there was still quite a lot of this around. I think there's a lot less of it now, where sort of it's almost like the point of the Q&A is to humiliate the speaker. Like, you know, and I think that it was clear to me that this person had been trained in that culture, and I think there's a lot to be said against it. And there certainly can be a form of combativeness that is not intellectually productive. But I also think that the opposite is also not that helpful. So, you know, like if you're just getting a lot of kind of approval and praise for your ideas, then you're not actually getting to inquire into them, right? And so I think that part of it is that there's maybe my psychology is a little bit idiosyncratic, and so I'm a little bit less by nature going to be offended by the kind of rudeness that was in fact being exhibited in this case, right? And I don't think people should be rude, and I try not to be, even though I'm not that sensitive to it. But I think for me, it was almost like the fact that I was a little bit immune to the rudeness allowed me to access this other thing where I'm like, even though he's also being rude, he's doing something kind of awesome. And he's really trying to like push and find like the biggest problem and just keep pushing. And he's not holding back at all in order to be sort of polite or deferential or nice. And you know, I think the challenge of doing philosophy well is like how to do as much of that as possible while still being humane. Socrates is a great role model here because he was sort of punctiliously polite and kind and affable in conversation, so much so that a lot of people constantly think he's being ironic, right? They're like, oh, he's not being serious when he's like, oh, wise Euthyphro, or oh, thanks for talking to me, I'm so happy, right? And it's like my view of all that stuff is like, you know, go to a talk of philosophers and listen to how they object. And they're mostly not like, hi, here's why you're wrong. They're like, I'm confused about one point, or like, oh, could you just clarify? Right? They're not being ironic, they're being polite, right? And it's hard. Like arguing with people is hard. It's psychologically hard. And we have to develop means of doing it that allow us to not hurt each other's feelings, but that allow us to do as much of it as possible while not hurting each other's feelings, right? And I think this guy had not optimized for that, in that most people would be offended by him, rightly. But I think that, you know, so we should think about who to have as our model. I think Socrates is a great model in that he pushes people really, really hard while remaining extremely polite to them. And we should like, I think, question our assumption that that means he's being ironic, like, as opposed to just like, this is how polite you have to be if you want to push people this hard.
Mm-hmm. Right. I don't know if Margaret wants to ask a question before me. Okay, I can go. So I was also really like intrigued. So in your piece, Is Public Philosophy Good? I was especially interested. You talked a little, the words that you used was kind of like philosophy is more about like thinking rather than like thought, like having a thought, in which you kind of, to me, it seemed like you were saying like most of the time during philosophy, like you're thinking through questions, but you don't necessarily always arrive at conclusions or like answers. And I was like especially interested here because with like our current problems such as like structural inequity and like racial injustice, it seems like we do require answers and like we're asked for answers. So like how can like philosophers like you know like find a compromise like in between this tension of like not really arriving at answers but also being asked to find answers?
Great question. So I think the answer is philosophers are not going to give you answers to those questions. That's kind of, I think, not the job of philosophers. I think the job of philosophers is to help you find answers that are actually your own answers, rather than kind of parroting an answer that we're basically given because other people have been giving it and it sort of sounds good. So like, and that answer we might say of the answer we're trying to give, like that the philosopher can give it with you or alongside you, but the point is they can't just hand it to you, right? And in a way, the whole point of the philosophical intervention is to say that with questions about, say, racial inequities, like a lot of the time we're not asking the questions. We like jump to certain solutions and then get really angry that other people don't want to adopt those solutions. And it's a little bit like that example of the sexual assault that I gave earlier, where it's like almost like the space for inquiring into what an answer would look like is not even there. And I think the philosopher's job is to create that space in which we can inquire, and they can inquire along with you, and they might come to an answer along with you. But the point is that they can't hand you the answer that they've independently come up with. That's a thing philosophers can't do. And that distinguishes philosophers, I think, from a lot of other kinds of intellectuals, right? And I think it's probably something philosophers share with other humanists, but like a physicist, you know, a virologist can just do their research and be like, here you go, here's the answer, here's the vaccine, etc. You don't need to understand how it works. I did that part for you, right? So you can defer the intellectual labor of inquiry to me, the expert in some fields. That's just not how philosophy works.
All right. I don't know if we're planning to do a Q&A right now.
I think Lisa, did you want to ask your question before we move to open Q&A, or?
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm just curious, Agnes, as a writing teacher, I want to hear a little bit about how you write, and whether the academic writing and the public writing is a different process for you. Because you talk, there's a piece in one of your pieces, you talk about sort of chasing after the answer that you can't find, and that's common to my experience of academic writing. I wondered if it was different for public writing for you, if you put a little less pressure on yourself, or the deadlines, or the audience helps and makes the process of writing for a public audience different than academic writing.
Yeah, I would say the process is very different. My academic writing often begins by me like giving a talk like to other academics, right? So maybe the way it's different is the different way in which other people figure in it, right? So I can't think of any paper I've ever written that didn't start as a talk in the academic paper, including the bits of my book. I mean, not every part of my book, not every chapter was a talk, but actually it's possible that every chapter was somehow a talk. Anyway, most of them were. And so essentially for an academic paper, the first way that I approach this is like, how am I going to sort of verbally explain this idea to other philosophers? And then I get objections, right? And the paper is essentially a record of the dialectic between me explaining the idea and me responding in some way to the objections. And then that continues through the, editorial process, because it'll be sent out to referees. The referees will have objections, right? So that's the process for an academic paper. The process for public philosophy is, first of all, often there's a deadline. There are no deadlines in academic philosophy, right? So that's a big difference. You're like, I got to write something by this time. And my column doesn't work that way. Like the point is great at working with me and being like, I'm like, I can't stand that kind of pressure. I've had writing offers that would have included regular deadlines. And I was like, no, I can't do it. I have a job and whatever. But nonetheless, like, even once you've started something with an editor, like you should follow through on it. And so, whereas like with academic stuff, sometimes I'll like put something aside for a year. I'll give a talk and then I'll just forget about it, and then I'll come back to it, and that's fine. No one cares, right? With academic writing, in a certain way, no one cares, and so that's really like low pressure. But with the public writing, yeah, there's the public writing generally, other than my column, will often start with like a pitch to an editor, right? In which I'll say like, here's my idea. And something that surprised me was learning that editors don't like prefer that you've secretly written the thing already. That's not what I would have thought that, right? Like they're like, you like it? Okay, here it is, right? No, that's not what they want. They want to work with you, and they want to shape the ideas in it. They want to give you guidance. And I find that really terrific. Like, I love working with editors. I love, like, it was just an amazing discovery to me that there's this whole class of intellectuals who are incredible at writing and at helping you communicate your ideas and at helping you question your ideas at the right points so as to make your communication better. So the absence of that in academic writing, I find like makes academic writing very sad in comparison on that front.
I love the words you're using. I think the sadness. It does feel very lonely to do academic writing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I guess that one other thing I would say is just like so I think my academic writing is more like public philosophy than the academic writing of most other philosophers. And my public philosophy so I'm a little closer, is more academic than other public philosophy. So my two forms of writing are a little closer than most people, even who do both. But still, I just think public philosophy has to be fun to read, and academic writing does not have to be fun to read. And so that makes a really big difference in how you write it.
Great answer. I thought your book was fun to read too, so.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to read off a couple questions here. So the first one comes from Sean Kirkland, who's kind of your parallel person at DePaul. He does work with the ancient Greeks. So he says, thank you for a terrific presentation. I'm wondering about whether you see a big appetite in the general public for putting our presumed and most fundamental beliefs in question. In 5th century Athens, Socrates encountered a fairly dramatic resistance to his public philosophical interrogations of his fellow citizens. They executed him. Do you think we in our contemporary culture have more or less interest in or tolerance for destabilizing our own most cherished values?
Great question. So I think Socrates encountered an amazing appetite for having values destabilized. He was, if you just think about how many people after Socrates wrote Socratic dialogues, I mean, we've lost most of them, right? We have Plato and we have Xenophon, and then we have Aristophanes in the clouds recording Socratic activity in some way, okay, distorting it, but also recording it. But there were all these other people who wrote Socratic dialogues, right? So Socrates was a big deal, right? So that means there was a huge appetite, and he talked to all these people. Everyone knew him. In some of the dialogues, people are like, "What? You haven't heard of Socrates? He's super famous, right?" So people want to talk to him. Public intellectuals who have something to lose by conversing with Socrates feel like they have to talk to him, right? So there was a tremendous appetite for what Socrates was doing in ancient Athens. And I would say the story of Socrates is the story of Socrates mostly not being killed for what he did, right? He was 70. So imagine getting to do that for decades, destabilizing the political regime through, tyrants and not tyrants, and people putting up with you and everybody wanting to talk to you and people writing about you. And like eventually he got killed. And that's bad, right? And so there was clearly an anti-Socratic movement as well. And so I suspect that that's roughly what it would be like now, but we think it's much less okay to kill people for their ideas than the Athenians did. They had just a standard policy for how you kill people when they have bad ideas, right? And they prosecuted Socrates legally under that charge. They didn't it wasn't like a mob that went out and got him or something, right? So I don't feel like I'm in a huge amount of danger. And I certainly think there will also be resistance to this, but I think there's a massive appetite for it. There was a massive appetite for it then, and I think there's a massive appetite for it now.
Just as a little follow-up to that, do you read or engage with the comments on your pieces at all, either through Twitter or in the actual comment sections?
So when the first time I wrote something in the New York Times, I thought I should try to respond to every comment. I thought that for 5 minutes. And then after that, actually my husband made a rule that I'm not allowed to look at the comments in the New York Times for 1 day after the piece is published, because he's like, once it's a day, then you have distance from it. So when there are comments in a venue like that, I kind of just don't look at them. When the point doesn't have comments, but people comment on Twitter, and I tend to respond when people comment on Twitter, ask questions or whatever. I don't 100%. The Twitter algorithm is weird, so occasionally I just don't even see something that is directed at me. But generally I do, and generally I respond. A lot of times the kinds of conversations I end up having and the follow-up and the back and forth is stuff like this, where people read it months ago or whatever, and they want to ask follow-up questions, right? So there's a lot of different ways that conversations can continue. And then I get for the New York Times, recently they've shut down comments they have not opened comments for the things that I've written. That means I get a lot of emails, hundreds of emails. I somehow, for me, it's very different. If there's an email versus a comment on a thing, I feel obligated to respond to the email. So I do respond to them, but generally briefly. And sometimes people are annoyed at me for not responding more, but it's they're not seeing the other side of how many emails I'm getting, that I can't conduct that many conversations at once. So part of it is a matter of I feel I'm still learning how to efficiently conduct a lot of different conversations such that people don't end up feeling sort of offended or slighted that I don't want to communicate with them. It's a coordination problem of my own life, really.
Yeah, that sounds hugely challenging, and it gives some insight on your brief emails. It's you're very good at sending a very.
I'm I've told this to my students, I don't say hi, the way I write emails is I just put the content in there. I don't say hope you're okay, or I just cut all that out. There's no sincerely yours. It's just how can I get the content in most efficiently?
Yeah. Okay, good. Let's take another couple questions here. So we have this one from Marilyn Ferdinand, who asks, journalists are on deadline and come out with opinions, which are often taken as answers. I think that can be very harmful. How can the philosophical intervention penetrate the way news is passed along?
Yeah, I think that, you know, I kind of really only started to pay attention to news like when I started to do public philosophy, like because I'm like, and I really appreciate the way journalists produce opinions because it's almost like I see all the possible reactions to an issue and like here they are and someone's like come up with them and it makes my own thinking more efficient. I think maybe the better thing to do is to think about like how to take in that information rather than like there's nothing else that a journalist can be doing in that kind of time frame. The reason they're producing quick opinions is that's what we want from them, right? So, and I think a thing to understand about media is it is always exactly what we want. It's a business, right? And so like the media is never like doing some evil stuff to us. They're just producing what we want. They're giving us information in the form that we want it. We might not like to see this about ourselves, that this is the form in which we want information, right? But that's what we're really seeing ourselves when we look at media. And the history of like shooting the messenger is very old, goes back to Herodotus, right? But I think, you know, the question is like, how do we make best use of the, you know, opinions of journalists where some good amount of effort has gone into producing those opinions on a short time. And I think the best way is to be like, think of it as like making your own thinking processes a bit more efficient, but not really giving you answers.
All right, great, thank you. All right, so let's take this as an anonymous question. Okay, we're in an academic setting, and the time. Let's see. So this is about reducing complicated ideas, I think. So it seems that many reductions have at worst caused a lot of political strife and death, and at best create large misunderstandings. Is the reduction of a concept for public consumption and accessibility worth the risk of having it wrapped up into something else entirely?
Ooh, good question. I think that, you know, in terms of the potential danger, I think there are potential dangers in making ideas publicly accessible, right? Like, what was Nietzsche's influence on Hitler? Like, probably not nothing, right? And so I think that if you think ideas can matter and that they make a difference to how we live our lives, then you also think they can matter in a bad way. I don't think you can get out of that. But I do think one thing you have to ask is, like, suppose the idea isn't there, right? That's also a choice you're making. Is the world then going to go great without the idea? So, and another way to think about it is like, you know, you could think of this idea as displacing another idea that would have been, say, you know, there, like, so I think it's more like, well, you have to, I suppose you do have to judge that you have something of value to contribute. That's the first part. And then, you know, you want to do your best. I think it's important to do your best to have the idea not make itself not easily assimilated into a dichotomy that the person had already antecedently sort of dug themselves into. And so that's why, like, I gravitate a little bit to somewhat paradoxical formulations and towards even just using a term in a slightly, you know, I'm writing something right now on anger management, where part of what I mean by anger management is like increasing the amount of anger that people have. And that's not usually a way that the phrase management is thought about. Right? So that's just like a small example. And, you know, I want my reader to think, wait, that is also anger management. Why are we always thinking we should be less angry? Like, a way of managing anger is to increase it too. And maybe there are contexts in which that's appropriate. So I think that in effect, there are forms of simplification that one can try to avoid, or ways of fitting into antecedent simplifications that one can try to avoid, and I do that, but I do think there is some risk.
I like that. It makes me, yeah, it makes me think you can sort of set some maxims for yourself or some sort of rules, like I will try and use this technique because I know it is less susceptible to me reducing ideas, but also that just, yeah, some sort of like poetry. It's short, but it's awesome too. It's not like reducing things necessarily. So just figuring out what's sort of genrically appropriate for a smaller space might be an important consideration. Okay. All right. So this sounds to me like a philosopher question, since they've co-sponsored. I'm going to read it, even though I don't fully understand it, from Russell Hogg. And he says, I really feel Peter Singer does give me answers. What is the distinction between his project and yours?
Peter Singer totally gives you answers. You're right, Russell. You know, Peter Singer has this like famous sort of utilitarian project that's going back to a paper in which he argues that we should all be giving to the point of marginal utility. So you should be giving away all your money to poor people, you know, up until the point where you're as poor as the person you'd be giving your money away to. And or at the very least, if you don't do that, you should be giving a lot more away than you do. And that it's absurd that we don't give away more than we do. And Singer thinks that, and then his project extends to like animal rights and like lots of other stuff, right? But so he's a utilitarian. He wants to tell people how to live, and like but he gives them arguments. So I think Singer is trying to tell me what to do, but he's trying to tell me what to do by giving me an argument. And I think that you know, there's a question like, how do I engage with like famine, affluence, and morality? So that famous paper. In which he talks about, you know, like if a kid were drowning in a pond near you, you would save their life. Now, what if they were drowning far away, but you would still do it, right? So why don't we do this? There are people drowning all over the world. We could save them. Why don't we save them, right? Basically is the argument, right? It's a simple argument. I teach it in class, and we think of, what are the objections, right? That's the way I engage with it, right? I engage with it intellectually. Now, like by looking at the steps of the argument, by raising objections, I can do that because Singer didn't just try to tell me what to do. He tried to give me reasons for doing something, right? And I think some people respond to that by just being like, I'm convinced, I'm going to go be an effective altruist, right? And so Singer has had this impact on people where he is going to tell them what to do. And I think if you think you have moral knowledge, then you not only should do that, but you have an obligation to do it. And so I guess what that shows is that there are different kinds of philosophers, right? So Singer is the kind of philosopher who thinks he has moral knowledge, and I'm a different kind of philosopher, but we both give you arguments because that's all a philosopher can give you. We can't just like hand you the knowledge. We have to hand it to you by way of arguments. And then it's up to you to decide, did we give you knowledge or not? And I think, Singer, you haven't given me knowledge because I have some objections to your argument, right? But other people think, no, you have given me knowledge. I'm going to go be an effective altruist.
All right, great answer. I like moral knowledge. That's good. Okay, so we're at 1:58. We do have more questions, but I want to respect everybody's time. I will end today's talk by just thanking Agnes for being here. It's been, like all of our panelists have said, it really was fun for us to read through your work of the last year. And your habits must be pretty good still, because your productivity is dropped off a little bit, but not much. And thank you all guests who have come and who have asked great questions. I see some comments in the chat about hoping to do something like this again. Agnes, you were a great first guest for us, so thank you so much. And on behalf of DePaul and HumanitiesX and the Department of Philosophy, thanks to all of our panelists today and our attendees.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
All right. Yeah, everyone have a nice day.
Bye.